just in case.
I'm in. Okay.
Okay, let's see. What the heck? Good thing you're recording. Okay. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Grant Cameron, and I have a special guest, and I have a co-host with me, Walter Rucker, today. And it was actually Walter who suggested this. As people know, I come from the UFO community, and in the UFO community, everybody considers themselves to be the Rodney Dangerfield of sciences. And therefore, they're always looking for people with master's degrees, PhD degrees, because it gives them some validity. And it really doesn't matter a lot of times, unfortunately, in the UFO community, what the person's saying, as long as they have a PhD. But we've got a PhD who's actually, I think, on the loop, as to know what's going on here. And I'm going to have some questions about how he got away with doing a PhD on the paranormal. But welcome, Walter. And you set up this meeting. So can you tell us who we're going to be talking to today and why this is so important for the paranormal community and maybe as well for the UFO community?
Well, I think for both communities, Grant, and Jack and I talked a little bit about this, we're all trying to find our common ground there. And although there seems like different subjects, UFOs, spirit, extraterrestrial communication, I think, Grant, in your all is one consciousness theology, if you want to call it that, ideology, this plays because you start to look at how these things cross over each other, where they are common, and how they may have all one common source as well. And one of the things that Dr. Jack Hunter has done that I felt really compelled to read and to study on was relationships between things such as physical mediumship, and recently wrote an article about its relationship and similarities to the Christ and the crucifixion stigmata. Now, these would seem to be like two entirely different subjects. One has a religious course to it, the other has a paranormal course to it, and never those trains shall meet. But in a number of things that Jack has written, and that being one, and let me tell you, I have every PDF I could ever find of his, and I had to buy a new hard drive just to put it all on. This guy has written more prolifically than anybody that I have ever seen in this field of crossing over between the paranormal, the spirit, and the extraterrestrial. And by taking what seemingly are weird ideas, the idea that physical mediumship, seances, levitations, physical phenomena, and the act of stigmatism, which we see not in North American countries as much as we see in other parts of the world, especially the South American parts, and getting those in a relationship that absolutely makes sense, and I believe brings a really new and different paradigm and a new investigation into paranormality, ideology, UFOlogy, and the like.
Yeah. So welcome, Jack Hunter, Dr. Jack Hunter, to our talk here. Maybe give a little bit of background, and I'm most interested in, I spent 37 years on a university campus, and therefore I know that academics and administrators on a campus can be very stodgy and kind of flat earthish. So I want you to go through your background, your books you've written, and basically how did you get away with writing a PhD based on the paranormal, on mediums?
Yeah. Well, my background is in anthropology, and I don't know if you know much about anthropology, but broadly speaking, it's the study of human beings. So you can kind of put pretty much anything that human beings do under the umbrella of anthropology, which is quite a handy starting point. But there's also kind of like a lineage within anthropology of investigating things to do with, religion, religious experience, mysticism, and also things like, indigenous religions and animism and all of those kinds of things. So already within anthropology, there's a kind of like a safety net, because there's a lot of literature around things like spirit possession and stuff in different contexts, different cultures. Interestingly, very rarely does anthropology concern itself with mediumship in Western societies, which is what I've done. But there is this whole cross-cultural literature on spirit possession out there. And usually what they do in these, anthropological approaches is try to explain things like spirit possession away in terms of social functions, so that the idea is that spirit possession rituals perform a function for society. They bind people together through performing rituals together, or they put people in contact with their kind of, traditions and history and those kind of things. But basically what they're saying is, we can explain these practices in terms of social functions or psychological functions, or, whatever, any kind of normal kind of sociological thing. And what I wanted to do was think about how, there's this whole literature from parapsychology from the past 150 years or so, psychical research in the 1800s and 1900s, parapsychology in the 1930s and 50s, that has been, expressly concerned with thinking about the ontological status of spirits, whether spirits are real or not, and trying to demonstrate that scientifically, in labs or through experiments and things like that. So there's this whole interesting parallel literature in parapsychology to do with whether spirits are real. And anthropologists had not really engaged with that kind of stuff. So they thought about the social and psychological functions and all of those things. They'd interpreted them as performances or, as rituals and dance and those kind of things, but rarely considered the possibility that actually, maybe the people who are doing these practices are onto something, that there could be something genuine going on. So that's where my interest came in. And I was very lucky to have a supervisor at the University of Bristol called Dr. Fiona Bowie. And she's done a lot of research on sort of the anthropology of religion and things like that. And at the time that I approached her about doing the PhD, she was becoming interested in mediumship herself and had been attending different mediumship demonstrations and, spiritual healing groups and things like that. So actually, it could have been, you could think of it maybe as like a, like a serendipitous meeting, but everything sort of worked out just right. And Fiona was on this course already. And then we kind of set up this group called the Afterlife Research Center, which was all about trying to promote social scientific and anthropological approaches to mediumship, shamanism, spirit possession, life after death, and all those kind of things. And the thing that is different about this approach is, coming from an anthropological background rather than a parapsychological background, is that we wanted to sort of engage with and participate in things ourselves, as anthropologists and as ethnographers, writing about our own experiences in the field. So I stumbled across this group called the Bristol Spirit Lodge. Actually, it took a little while for me to find them. And first of all, I would go around spiritualist churches and sit in on those sort of mediumship demonstrations. But I felt like I wasn't able to establish a rapport with the people in those sort of congregations, because it seemed to me as an outsider that the congregations in those churches was kind of constantly fluctuating. So, someone would come in one day because they had an interest in mediumship, and then they might not come the next day. Or someone would come in because they were going through a grieving process for a week or 2 weeks or so on, and then they wouldn't come back again. So I felt like I was kind of anonymous, and I wasn't getting the kind of information that I wanted to. So I did a little search online, and I had just another happy coincidence. So I stumbled across this group called the Bristol Spirit Lodge, and they were literally about a 20-minute walk up the road from where I was living. So, they've been there this whole time. And I looked on their website, and they had a blog on all details about the various different seances they were holding, more than one seance on a weekly basis. So I got in touch with the circle leader and asked, a few questions, and if maybe I could come and have a chat about mediumship and that kind of stuff. And she welcomed me over, and it just sort of spiraled out from there, really. I got on well with Christine, the circle leader, and we had a good chat and conversation. And she could see that my interest was, genuine. Because, the idea of inviting someone from a university or, you know, a researcher into a private home circle could be quite, you know, daunting for someone. So I knew I had to, you know, show that I was, you know, trustworthy and those kinds of things. But yeah, we built up a good rapport, and then I started to attend seances and things like that. And ultimately, yeah, my thesis kind of came out of it. So it was a combination of happy coincidences in a few ways, but having the right kinds of supervisors, and within anthropology as well, situating it within a body of literature that was already there, that was kind of uncontroversial, and then building on it and taking it into new places.
Wow.
So that's how I survived it.
Well, one more question, and I'll throw it to Walter. Walter's actually the guy that gets me in the circles, and you mentioned a thing which people may not realize. A lot of them are sort of like closed circles. They don't like researchers like me or academics like you coming in, because you're going to break the vibration of the circle and all this. So Walter's my in. He's the guy that gets me in the circles and does all that for me. But did you have an experience that sort of, because usually if you were in the paranormal, you have some sort of experience earlier in your life that makes you open to these kind of ideas?
Yeah, I did. A few experiences, really, thinking back to it. One of the most profound ones was to do with psilocybin. The very first time I took magic mushrooms, and I was quite young at the time, probably too young, but that's the way it goes. And it was the very first time that I had these mushrooms. And we live in Wales, so you can go, the mushrooms grow on the hills here. So you pick them, you know, October, November time, they just grow. So there was a time when there was an abundance of mushrooms and my friends had all picked mushrooms and there was plenty going around. So there was this time when the first time I tried them, and it was with my friend. The context is important as well, I think, because my friend's older brother, who was kind of introducing us to this stuff, was into magic and Wicca. And we had, in the room where we took the mushrooms, there was a circle, you know, magical circle laid out on the floor and all of these kinds of things, which, you know, probably had some bearing on my experience. But, you know, we weren't doing anything. We weren't doing any ritual or anything like that. We were just, you know, chilling out and listening to music and stuff like that. But there was this one moment where there was a chest of drawers in the corner of the room, and the top drawer was kind of hanging out of the chest of drawers, you know, so that you could see inside and there was stuff in it. And in the panel along the side of the drawer, in the grain of the wood, I saw like a procession of small, I said at the time, I just said, oh my God, I'm seeing fairies. Because I didn't know how else to describe them. But they were these small, two-dimensional goblin-like creatures. You know, they had long pointed noses. They were quite kind of like feminine featured, you know, like very slender. And there was a female who, you know, was possibly slightly taller than the other ones, at leading the procession. And she turned to face me. If you can imagine, you know, how something could turn in 2 dimensions, I don't really know, but it turned to face me and kind of clocked me. But, you know, classic fairy kind of experience, it was kind of nonplussed. It wasn't that interested in my presence. So they recognized that I had seen them, and then they kind of carried on in their procession. And I must have, you know, kind of lost interest in it somehow, and just, you know, drifted off to focus on something else. And that was the extent of the experience. But it puzzled me for a long time, because these beings, you know, to me, there was a qualitative difference between the way that they were acting and behaving and the way that other kinds of psychedelic hallucinations would act and behave. You know, so the psychedelic trippiness of the mushrooms, you know, the fractally kind of things and things twisting and distorting. There was all that kind of stuff, which is fair enough. But then these guys seemed to have, you know, they seemed to be deliberately doing something. They had an intention, and they were in a procession. They clocked me and they weren't interested in me. You know, it sounds like something else. So I've done a lot of thinking about this experience. And I think in a way, it was that experience and trying to make sense of what these other kinds of intelligences or consciousnesses or whatever they are might be that led me into the anthropology of religion and trying to think about how, other people interact with supernatural beings and things like that. And so I came to mediums.
One more question before I throw it to Walter, and that is, you mentioned this. Looking back, you've thought about it. Do you think this is like a random experience? Because what you're describing is basically what happened to Strassman with the DMT. That he has the DMT experience, and he has these beings come through the fire waterfall and say, "Now you see us. Now you see us. Now you see us." And that led him to this whole research that has now become very famous with the spirit molecule and stuff like that. So, what do you see about random versus pattern in the universe? Are things random or are they pattern?
It's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, I think that the sequence of events probably goes back further as well for me, because it wasn't my first experience, but it was a powerful one. I'd had another experience that I had was also to do with fairies, and I must have been a bit younger this time. And my friend and I had, for some reason, been trying this meditation out. And we were kids. I mean, it's strange, but we found this book about meditating and trying to encountering fairies through meditation. And we tried it. And I don't think, he had any success with it, but I'm not sure I did either. But I did have a dream kind of around the same time about this place an area out the back of my parents' house where we used to go to sometimes. And that they used to do mining there. And there was an old cliff face that was kind of exposed. And in my dream, I saw through the rock into a kind of like a small, like into a warm chamber. And you know bracken, like the ferns, it's kind of like it dies in the autumn and it goes all red and golden. And it was like this chamber was kind of like laid out with bracken inside it. And there were these creatures in there. And again, one of them looked up and clocked me. And that's about the extent of the dream. But there are these things. Are they connected? They could well be.
Yeah.
And I mean, I could even trace it back further to my interest in vampires when I was really little and things like that. I mean, I've always been interested in UFOs and monsters and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to untangle, I think.
Fascinating.
Well, one of the things that comes to mind is that I've never had that type of being experience. I don't know if Grant has or not. I don't believe he has. But what catches you is the fact that you have these illusions, dreams, hard, as you say, to figure out exactly what they are, thoughts, manifestations. And in the manifestation, you have the same thing going on over in physical mediumship. So kind of segue one into the other. You really kind of are talking about the same type of thing. And I'm going to read something that you wrote. I'll paraphrase it. And if you comment on it, I'd appreciate it. Physical mediumship development sittings may then function as a form of physiological monitoring for the medium in trance. With data about external manifestations being fed back to the medium via the circle leader and the sitters, and thus reinforcing the manifestations of a particular phenomena or phenomenon. And what I think you're saying there is that when you sit in a physical mediumship seance, the manifestations is a collective consciousness. That I don't know if I necessarily even understand how that works. But it seems to be when you talk to the mediums, they'll tell you the same thing, that I'm as good as my sitters. I'm as powerful as the energy in the room. There's lots of different ways of saying it. I don't know if you've ever done this before, Jack, but I've actually walked into a seance room and you can just feel it. The energy's not there. And the seance inevitably will be less phenomenal. And this was really true of Warren Kaler. I found great fluctuations in his mediumship due to the attitude, the energy, the creativity of the sitters themselves. So you're saying it's kind of like the same thing. It's like like a psilocybin trip. There are things that are being manifested that may have to do with you culturally. For instance, you're in Wales, so you manifested fairies.
Yeah.
I didn't manifest any fairies, dragons and monsters and weird people and everything else, but never any fairies because there's no fairies in my life at the time. So you have that real nice interplay between the culture that you're involved in, what you manifest, who you are, and how that works even in the seance room. So a comment about the collective consciousness aspect, the sitter, the medium, how you see that working, and what the information you might have on that.
Yeah, the piece that you're paraphrasing from is about how mediumship might be a kind of like a form of biofeedback training. And the reason that I started to think about this was because I was going to these seances, I was participating in them on a regular basis, and it seemed to me that it was a very gradual process. It wasn't like this relates to something else that I'm thinking about at the moment, about the metaphors that we use to talk about mediumship. So you might have heard about people talking about the spiritual telegraph and things like that, using a technological metaphor, thinking about the brain as like a radio receiver and it's tuning into spirits or things like that. But my experience of mediumship was of this gradual process of development, where a spirit might not fully manifest in the first seance. It might just be a twitch or a gurgle or something. And then over weeks of development and of focusing intention on it, you kind of nurture this spirit into existence. Okay, so the idea is then that this process of nurturing the spirits into existence might be better understood in terms of more kind of biological process kind of terminology rather than technological, mechanistic kind of terminology. And then, so this idea of the seance as a biofeedback system, I was looking at other kinds of extraordinary mind-body phenomena. So like you mentioned before, things like stigmata, where, people who are deeply, deeply religious, who are deeply enmeshed within a very particular cultural world, express or manifest the signs of the crucifixion on their bodies. So it's a similar kind of thing. And there are other things to do with stigmatics that are very similar to physical mediumship. I mean, the manifestation of blood, for example, the manifestation of fluids or, bodily excretions, that kind of thing is interesting. There's also accounts of stigmatics whose hands would grow to extraordinary sizes, or their bodies would shrink down, their heads would shrink and they would become really small. And there are similar accounts accounts from seances of the medium's head shrinking and disappearing, for example, or, the medium's hand suddenly being really large. I know Shannon Taggart has a great photograph of a medium that she, in a seance that she attended, and that you can see this enormous hand. I mean, no one knows what the deal is with the photo, and Shannon's open to all of those, possibilities with that. But it's just interesting, this connection between bodily extremities, parts of the body expanding and contracting, or fluids secreting out of the body. So I was thinking about, where are other places where biofeedback can produce these kinds of extraordinary, mind-body effects? And we know that it's possible to, for people to train themselves, to reduce their heart rates or to increase their heart rates or to change their body temperature and things like that with biofeedback training. So you might, for example, connect yourself up to a heart rate monitor. And because you've got that feedback coming back at you, you learn to control your heart rate. It's demonstrated that people can do this. It's a scientific fact. It's mind over matter, essentially. So my idea is that, these physical phenomena, stigmata and things like that, and physical mediumship, and I'm not saying all elements of physical mediumship, but certainly some anyway, might be a kind of like a super extension. This is an idea that comes from a German vitalist parapsychologist called Hans Driesch, And he thought that parapsychological phenomena like materializations were just super extensions of normal biological processes, just pushed to the extreme. So I think that, the seance then operates as a feedback device, because you have the medium who goes into their trance, they gurgle, they make strange noises, and then it's the group that picks up on that and feeds back into it, saying, you're doing really well. This voice, you can come through. We can help you. We'll all put our energy into this and help you to come through. And over time, through this feedback from the sitters, a strong kind of stable spirit personality emerges. So yeah, the same goes for things like ectoplasm. I mean, from your own experience of going into seances, that the group encourages the phenomena to manifest. The mood has got to be right, the atmosphere has got to be right. And they'll all say things like, they'll all be like, wow, when something actually manifests. So they're giving a feedback. You could think about it in positive, negative reinforcements or whatever. If everyone is feeling positive and is, giving a reward when a manifestation occurs, then it's more likely to occur. So yeah, it's like this long process of feedback and slowly developing mediums over a process of time, rather than, the medium being some kind of a receiver that just zooms in and clicks into a specific channel or something.
You mentioned stigmata, which I just had a panel that was done on UFO people seeing triangles. It seems to be a big thing, but people will find triangles on their body. And I always described the stigmata thing as like, why does an alien have to leave a triangle on somebody's body? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Or scoop marks and stuff like that. And the person just suddenly realizes like this, oh, wow, this is for real. This was not a dream. This actually happened. So when you were doing your PhD and you were in the seances, what led you to believe that this is the real deal? What kind of stuff were you seeing in there that led you to realize this is an important phenomenon that needs to be studied?
Yeah, there's an interesting thing about my experiences in the seances as well. I don't know if you know about, in parapsychology, they talk about a decline effect. So that when you might start off with a really good experiment that produces really good statistically significant results. And then as you try to repeat that, it will decline. And sometimes in parapsychology, it even goes the other way and comes back as a psi missing effect, like a strongly statistically significant negative effect. And I had a similar kind of thing with my involvement with mediumship. So the very, very first seance I attended, which was interesting for a lot of reasons. One of them was because it was right in the morning, like at 9 a.m. And I was expecting a seance to be, like in the middle of the night in a Victorian mansion. It was, in a suburban house at 9 o'clock in the morning, actually in the garden shed. So it blew my mind in those senses. But in the actual seance itself, I saw, in my very first seance, I saw these small flickers of light around the back of the medium when she was going into her trance. And they seemed to be, to me, to be hallucinations, really, that they were subjective phenomena. I have seen in seances with Warren Kaler, though, lights that appeared to be physical lights, which is another thing entirely, and much more dubious in a lot of ways. But the first seance I went to, these lights seemed to be kind of like hallucinations. And then later on during the seance, I saw the medium's face begin to kind of like change, like transfiguration. I didn't know about transfiguration at the time. It's only afterwards, researching it, that I found out that this is a kind of like a common phenomenon in spiritualism. But I saw the medium's face kind of cover over with this green, a green mask kind of thing. And it looked to me like a stereotypical kind of image of like a Chinese monk, like a bald head, that kind of thing. And it was really strange. And it kind of appeared over the face, and it just sort of slid down and disappeared kind of around her chest. And I thought, this is odd. I'm observing this is my, this is my first seance. Strange. I can see this thing, but I'm not going to mention it to anyone because probably people will think I'm crazy. It seems so subjective. But then when we went back out into the house after the seance had finished, to have tea and cakes and talk about all of the things that were going on, independently, someone else said, "Did you see that green face? Did you see that Chinese monk?" And I had no choice but to say, yeah, I did see it. I saw it, but I thought it was a subjective hallucination. So how could something that was seemingly subjective like that, a hallucination, be kind of shared by other people in the group, people that I'd never met before? And it didn't look like the media. I genuinely do not think that the medium could have faked it, because it was like a hallucination, but it was a shared hallucination. But what I'm saying is that at the time of my greatest involvement with it, early on, when I first started to go to the seances and I was first participating in it, I had these kinds of experiences. And when I went home, I would see flashing little flashes of light and things, and I was like fully in it, in the world, of spiritualism. But gradually, it started to, peter off. And I'd be going to seances and I'd just be sitting there thinking, what am I doing here? Nothing's happening. Why have I devoted my life to this? But the initial experience, was enough to be, it's something to grab onto, isn't it? And the fact that it kind of fits this general pattern with these kind of phenomena, where they do seem to go through these peaks and troughs of activity, it makes sense. So it was interesting.
Go ahead, Walter.
The idea of sitting in silence, when I'm asked, some advice on it, there's really not much advice you can get, except don't stick your feet out in the middle of the floor and trip up an ectoplasmic being. Outside of that, there's really just sit there and enjoy it with an open mind. But I always tell people, I said, look, there's going to be so much going on in there, especially your first seance or two. Try to just break it up into sections. In other words, if spirit A comes through, okay, let's see, is that a real objective voice? Is that a real entity? Who is this type of thing? Spirit B comes through. Okay, what do we have here? Because you can move from things that are extremely convincing to things that are extremely unconvincing, almost to the point of being boring. Yeah. And back in again. It's like you say, it is very much a roller coaster. And if you try to take the whole experience and say, well, it's fraudulent or it's absolutely foolproof or what, you're going to miss a lot of the experience itself. So it's too bad that we haven't got, and hopefully we're going to get to this, and this a little lead in here, working with Grant and several others, including Shannon and a filmmaker, Ronnie Thomas, who you may know, and has done a lot of work. And we're talking very seriously about putting on what we call a celebrity seance. And the idea is, and you're on a short list, by the way, of having to attend this, but the idea here is to bring in people who can do filming, who can do pre-seance and post-seance interviews, who have a feeling of this like you do, a different kind of approach to this, and to get all these things recorded as best as we possibly can so that we can walk away with this with a more definitive approach to and understanding of physical mediumship. Because you, as you know, and as I've had, you can have experiences that leave you completely flummoxed. There's just no, you'll be thinking about them until the day you die, and you'll never come up with an answer. Somebody else may be sitting in there and have the same experience as you did, just as you did with the being that you saw, same experience, and yet have a completely different take on it. And being able to pass that information back and forth and bring in people from the ufology community, from the extraterrestrial community, from the spirit community, and putting them all in the same hopper and letting them have the same seance experiences. We're working with Kai on this, so you'll know. Seemed to be a good idea to try to promote this a little bit further. Because one of the questions I'm going to ask you is, and you talk about this, is what exactly is going on in the physical mediumship, the part that we call the spirit part. I mean, are these really discarnate human beings? Are these extraterrestrials or goofing with us? Are these interdimensional beings? I mean, who are these people? And in the seance, you really do not have, because of the structure of the seance, you don't have that opportunity to ask questions that would expose an identity. You cannot ask Winston Churchill something that isn't already known through half the world. You know, as well as he's been autobiographed and biographed.
Mm-hmm.
But you can get to a point where you can start to have some meaningful conversation, and then but you can't ever really get to the point where you can prove that's Winston Churchill, or this is a Yellow Feather, or this is Luther, or whomever the spirit or spirits coming through are. And that's a very difficult thing for a lot of people to deal with. With me, the mystery is in the fun. The fun's in the mystery. If I had answers to all that, we probably wouldn't be having these conversations. But what's your take on what's going on in there? One thing, spirits, ETs, discarnates, who is it?
It's a good question. It's the ultimate question. Well, you know, in parapsychology, they talk about this as the psi or super psi, the survival debate. You know, so they're basically saying that based on the evidence that we have from physical medium or all mediumship, basically, there's no way that we can tell the difference between a really, you know, accentuated psi ability, you know, telepathy or things like that, or remote viewing and that kind of thing, and a genuine spirit personality. Because like you're saying, any information about these personalities could easily or equally be accessed via psi, you know, so there's not really any way of saying it. So you end up in parapsychology with these two different camps of those who adopt us, you know, the survival hypothesis that it's spirits that are doing these things, and those who adopt the psi hypothesis. But my way of thinking is usually to try and collapse these kind of binary distinctions. And I think that really there isn't any, you know, the two ideas are not mutually exclusive. You know, spirits are going to have to employ some kind of psi, some kind of telepathy, some kind of psychokinesis, you know, in order to manifest. You know, if they are discarnate beings, non-physical beings, or essentially minds without bodies, then they need some kind of a mechanism. And that mechanism, you know, from what we know from parapsychology, is likely to be psychokinesis and psi. So, you know, maybe we're going down the wrong track in trying to, you know, in arguing for one camp or the other. And actually, we should be investigating more how these different processes interact with each other. You know, so we're saying we're not going to say it's either psi or spirits. We're going to say it's probably a combination of both in some sense.
Kai Mugi's seance starts. He'll do 5 days. Come in on a Monday and leave on a Sunday, and work for 4 or 5 days in there, and at least 2 of those days will be table turning or table tipping or whatever you want to call it, where you sit down with the medium, usually a circular table, but doesn't have to be, and they put their hands lightly on top, and the table begins to move and rock, and can even answer yes and no questions depending upon which way it rocks, and etc. and so on. And I asked Kai about this. I said, Kai, what's going on there? I mean, you know, if there were ectoplasmic pseudopods, rods, coming out from your stomach, picking up the table, well, we have photographs of that in light. That's not going to be possible for an ectoplasmic rod to form and function in light. So what's going on there? And I don't know. I mean, you know, he's been doing this for 20 years now. He has no idea. And trying to turn that back to his physical mediumship seance, say, look what he does in his table. We don't know how this works. Psychokinesis, maybe. Again, collective consciousness of the sitters, energy, maybe.
Or
Spirit, absolutely. And then you take that back over into the seance, and you've got basically the same questions, just with a different subject title to it. So it really makes for some really interesting experiences. Grant, do you have something?
Yeah, going a little bit farther on that idea, everybody in the paranormal world or philosophy world has to answer the question, which I'll ask you, is what comes first, like the chicken egg thing? Is it nuts and bolts or is it consciousness? So what's your view on this theory of everything? How do you see the world playing out?
Yeah. Well, I think the way that I lean with this is towards a kind of animism. So, some people would lean towards the idea of like idealism or something, where consciousness is the fundamental ground of reality, which I think it is to some extent, but basically that we're all in one kind of like cosmic universal mind or something. But I tend to go down the route of seeing, although there is a kind of like a oneness and there is consciousness or mind distributed throughout the universe or whatever, that there are also like there's also a whole lot of diversity within that. This comes from some of the work that I'm doing at the moment, looking at biological and ecological principles and thinking about how they might help us to understand the paranormal. So when you look at an ecosystem, for instance, an ecosystem, it works as a whole. It is a unity. Like a forest ecosystem is a single organism essentially, but it's a single organism that's made up of lots and lots and lots of individual parts within it that are all working together. So the individual trees, the individual plants, the soils and the water and all of those kind of things. And they all come together to create something that is essentially, like more than the sum of its parts. And I think that we can think about mediumship in a similar kind of way, or seances in a similar kind of way, that they are kind of like, a combination of lots and lots of different factors in a single moment. So you have the combination of things like psi and telepathy and the intention of the sitters, and then all of the social and cultural things that are going on within a group of human beings interacting with each other, all the psychological processes, the physiological processes that we've been talking about, in terms of like physical mediumship and stuff like that. And then also this animistic principle of there being intelligence and life out there, so that when we're tapping into these things, we might be tapping into, the consciousness of, the room that we're in, or we might be tapping into another consciousness within the medium, or we might be tapping into a fairy or a discarnate spirit. We just don't know. But my approach then is just to say that there are many different minds, lots of different kinds of minds at different levels of, I don't even want to think about them in terms of levels. I don't want to put any kind of like hierarchy on it, but that there are many minds, basically. So rather than saying that it is all just consciousness, I'm saying, well, it is all consciousness, but there's many different kinds of consciousness within that. Different animal consciousness, plant consciousness, spirit consciousness, and all those things. And they're all interacting to make the world the complex place that it is.
Just a related question before Walter goes back. You've written a lot about nature, and if you remember the story, Dennis McKenna does ayahuasca in the rainforest, and he suddenly realizes we're destroying the rainforest. And we've got to do something. And then my mother ayahuasca says, you monkeys just think you're running the show. The plants are running the show. So you've written a lot about the plants and trees working together. Mm-hmm. And you look at this situation, how do you see what's happening in the United States, where somebody can do a couple of executive orders and basically roll back the ecology to the 1950s? Do you think we're going to make it?
Well, it's a very unfortunate situation with what's been going on in America. I don't know. I hope that we can make it. I think that there is enough. One of the things I've talked about in relation to this is how there seems to be action from both the top-down perspective to do with climate change and the environment and all these kind of things, but there's also an upwelling from the bottom up as well. So there are, community projects, community gardens and individual people who are doing all sorts of amazing stuff on the ground. And we also have things like the Paris Agreement, which, although America pulled out of it, it's a top-down initiative to try and do something. And I think it's kind of a positive sign that we've got these two different both coming from different angles, but kind of converging on the same thing. So I want to be hopeful. And with this, the coronavirus thing that's going on at the moment, and the fact that, back in March, pretty much we managed to get the Earth's, excess global CO2 levels right down, and we still managed to somehow live our lives normally, well, relatively normally, shows that we can actually do this. We can do that. So, it's not necessarily related to the paranormal, but I think there's reason for us to be optimistic, but that doesn't mean that we have to let our guard down about it.
Are you familiar with the entity, the extraterrestrial Bashar, as channeled by Daryl Anko? Well, he has a different take on this. Let me throw Bashar's take on this. It's pretty simple. He says, look, you create your own physical reality. He explains the mechanics, but that's beside the point right now. So if you want to create a physical reality, that's your intent, purpose, and what you want, and that physical reality includes an ecological disaster, that's the one that you signed up for.
Yes.
But you can equally create a physical reality where none of this happens. So which one did you sign up for? Which one do you want? You're going to get only what you believe in. And you're going to create whatever you want out of that. Now, in another thing I want to tell you about, I got a call, an email from a Unity church that wanted me to come and talk to them about Christ as a medium. Actually, I put it forward to them. I said, look, there's a lot in the New Testament that indicates, and the Old Testament as well, but in the New Testament indicates that Christ was transfigured, that there may have been, he may have been, or there may have been in his group a physical medium, and that his resurrection, his transfiguration and ascension into heaven was an ectoplasmic covering, and the spirit manifestation by one of the apostles or somebody in his group, maybe Mary Magdalene, who knows, and that was the case. And I went to sleep and I dreamt that I did that. I did end up doing it, but I dreamt that I did that. And I gave my little 30-minute speech and whatnot. And at the end, I looked up and nobody said a word. Just looked at me like I was nuts. And so I thought, well, I'll just get off this pedestal here and just move along.
Well,
I've often wondered about that. If there could be some historical significance to that idea.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, within religion, we tend to think about religion and the paranormal as two separate things. But again, like we've seen with stigmata, stigmata is just another form of physical mediumship. So, we're basically dealing with, I think, human capacities that manifest at certain times, and they get kind of, again, like honed in on by a group of people. And then sometimes those things get turned into a religion. But usually what happens is, like George Hansen talks about with these mediumship groups, they kind of break apart and crumble. But sometimes, every now and again, it crystallizes and it becomes a movement or something. But who knows how long they last for? We've had a 2,000-year-long movement. Maybe it's starting to crumble.
We're coming up on an hour, so let me ask you one thing about mediumship. When you look at the seances, is there anything you can think of that, if you had the money and the time, that you would use to try to validate this, to make it be better researched? And can you talk about what you're doing now? You're working on some different projects, I heard. Talk about what you're into now and what you're hoping to accomplish.
Yeah, well, in terms of researching mediumship, what I think would be interesting would be to do more field-based research with mediums, because a lot of the time in parapsychology, the emphasis is on bringing the mediums into the lab and doing controlled studies and all of those kind of things. But we know from anthropology and from anthropologists like Ernesto Di Martino, an Italian anthropologist, that when we do this, we're taking the phenomenon out of its ecological context. out of the natural environment within which these experiences usually occur, and out of the kind of social and emotional context within which they usually occur. So it's not really surprising that when we get, the paranormal in the lab in the form of psi or, mediumship studies, that we're just dealing with small statistically significant effects. Whereas when you go to a seance or something, you're dealing with something of a magnitude that's much greater. So what I think would be beneficial for mediumship research going forward would be to take a leaf out of anthropology's book and to do much more kind of field-based research in the situations in which these experiences usually take place. But also to think about mediumship, not necessarily in terms of trying to prove or disprove whether the phenomena are genuine, but to think about other things as well. In the same way that anthropologists might study, spirit possession in India, or, the elaborate ritual performances in Nepal or whatever, we can study these kind of things as cultural phenomena in their own right, regardless of whether they are, genuine or not. Although I think that there is some kind of genuineness going on there, but there are whole other things that we could think about. So in my research, I've thought about how is the body used in mediumship seances? How does the body get used to express different personalities? What's the relationship of that to things like acting and pretending and stuff like that? So yeah, that kind of thing would be interesting to see more research on other aspects of mediumship. But that, that relates to my research that I'm doing at the moment, which is to do with ecology and nature and things like that, and trying to understand, like I've been saying throughout this talk, about how maybe ecological or biological principles metaphors might be better for understanding the paranormal than technological physics-based models and things like that. But also thinking about the role of extraordinary experiences in initiating ecological activism. So there's some interesting stuff about John Mack, the UFO researcher, argued that the alien abduction phenomenon is occurring in the context of this global ecological crisis, and that lots of abductees and contactees come back from their experiences feeling that they have to do something to help the Earth. So there's some strange, interesting connections in there, running right through the paranormal. We could also think about things like the Loch Ness Monster. We can go as far as we want with the paranormal, Bigfoot and things. Are they nature spirits? Are there other ways that we could think about them beyond the kind of like standard classic, cryptozoological models or things like that? So my new ecological approach is opening up lots of interesting avenues for exploration. Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Beautiful.
If I could jump in real quick, my wife had a really unusual experience in a seance. She was called to the cabinet. She and I were sitting, and 10 or 15, 20 others, whatever. She was called to the cabinet, sit in a seat in front of the cabinet. And while she was sitting there, the circle leader was sitting to her right. She was sitting in front of the cabinet, in front of the medium who was in the cabinet. And the CD player, which is typical, that you have some kind of a boom box or CD player to people can sing and amp energies and the like, came on to the tune Imagine. And John Lennon came through in as clear a John Lennon voice as I can possibly imagine, hummed a few verses to her and really made her day because she was a huge Lennon fan. And with that, I want to say to John Lennon how much I miss you. And Grant, what wonderful work you did in the book that highlighted. Is it Tuned In?
Tuned In, the Paranormal World of Music, yeah.
Yeah, and anybody that hasn't read that needs to read that. And the stuff, especially about John and his ufology and extraterrestrial abduction possibilities and all that. But nonetheless, it's a great read, and I really miss him. And John, I know you're listening. And I think I killed Grant.
The death of John Lamb.
Say it one more time, Grant. You were dead on.
Oh, hang on. Yeah, today's the 40th anniversary of the death and you said that John Lennon actually stood on your wife's feet, right? That it was a real, wasn't just a.
No, there wasn't John. Lennon didn't. He put his hands on her shoulders.
Oh, okay.
While he hummed these three verses. It was, let me tell you, it was absolutely stunning. It was just, we just all went, what in the world is going on now? You know? But the fact that it related to her interests, she had the John Lennon Beatles cap when she was growing up, you know, way back before Jack Hunter even knew what birth was like.
Yeah.
Back in those old days in the 60s and 70s. And so, and she never said anything to anybody about it. So this came directly either from spirit, from some John the Discarnate. These are the kinds of things that leave you with all the fun, all the mystery, and all the awe, and all the questions.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I just want to have one more question, then we'll end it. Have you got your PhD, your teaching there? Do you have graduate students and people like that who are following on and doing various projects related to this?
Yeah, well, at the moment, I teach for the Sophia Centre at the University of Wales, Trinity St David. I'm also a research fellow with the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Research Centre, which is also in the university. And at the moment, I'm teaching on a master's course on ecology and spirituality. So we're focusing on that. So I've got a bunch of students who are studying these intersections between ecology and the spiritual and the paranormal. And I also have a student who's researching near-death experiences in Colombia, which is really interesting.
Beautiful. Well, thanks for your work. I mean, it's encouraging to see academia picking this up and running with it, because a lot of people, if I tell a story or Walter tells a story, they don't listen. But if someone like you tells a story, then they go, oh, it's got to be true. It's got to be true. The guy knows. He's a smart guy.
Yeah.
And he's got a beard. He's got a beard, for God's sake.
Yeah.
Bearded people don't lie. Look at Jesus.
So thanks a lot, and hopefully we can do this again, and we'll keep up on your research and follow what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Jack, thank you very much. And Grant, again, thank you so much for having me on as your co-host. I'm really appreciative. And it's been a lot of fun. Thanks, guys.
Beautiful.
See y'all.
Okay.